Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Worcester Business Journal's Mid-Year Economic Review, a webcast that will take a look at what lies ahead for the nation, our state, and our region. I'm the WBJ publisher, Peter Stanton, and I'm joined by a panel of experts who are going to share their view of the current economic conditions and their thoughts on where we go from here. This special session is brought to you by the support of our friends at Middlesex Savings Bank, one of the largest mutual savings banks in the country that has been serving businesses in our region for 185 years. Every year in late January or February, Worcester Business Journal teams up with the Worcester Regional Chamber of Commerce to put on an annual economic forecast. This year was no different than the last few. Our panel of experts predicted slow to modest growth and no real break in the record low unemployment numbers. Ho-hum. Well, as the Ides of March approached, that rosy outlook began to shift, and by early spring had done a full 180. Instead of steady growth, our world was turned upside down by the coronavirus. We went into shutdown mode, the economy gone to a halt, and all the projections of just a couple months earlier were suddenly out the window, which I think is why everyone's attending today, which is where are we now and what just happened over the last several months and what does it look going forward. So with the lone exception being the stock market, which has chugged ahead as if the pandemic didn't exist, a lot of things have been reset. So it reminds us how quickly things can change and what forecasters and economists really know about the future. Well, usually they know a lot, but sometimes things change quickly. So I've held on to an old New Yorker cartoon in my office that kind of sums up where we are right now. There it is, the era of reduced expectations. And I think we're going to hopefully look a little further ahead than the old left foot coming into view, but we'll all recognize that future remains somewhat cloudy. So in order to discern what the data, so in today's sessions, we're going to again look at that rather cloudy crystal ball and try to discern what the data is telling us about the current state of our economy, but what the future might bring. Today joining us is Jeff Fuhrer, Senior Fellow at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Prior to that, Jeff spent 35 years as a senior executive at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, and Jeff will give us an overview of the broader economic conditions, as well as touch on the economic impact of some of our systematic inequalities that lead to embedded disadvantages for far too many Americans, especially minorities. Julie Georgioulas is the Director of Research for the East Coast in Canada at the real estate firm JLL, where she works out of the Boston office. And Julia will give us a deep dive into the changing workplace, the current trends in commercial real estate, some of the long-term implications of remote working. And Robert Bauman is a professor and chair of the economics department at the College of the Holy Cross, or the Cross, depending on where you're coming from. And Robert will give us a more local view of economic trends on the ground here in Worcester and Central Mass and share some insights on the pandemic's impact on our region. Both Jeff and Julia have shared the podium at our annual economic forecast events in the past, and Robert is a first-time guest. So welcome to all three of you, and thank you for taking your time to share your expertise with our audience. We're going to ask Jeff to kick things off, but before I do, I just want to tell you about one of the highlights that's sitting at the end of our session. Jeff is known in some circles as the singing economist, and at our 2018 economic forecast, he played his ukulele from the stage. So for any of those who saw him then, you'll be looking forward to sort of our closing song, because Jeff has prepared a number that's going to be the wrap up for today's session. So don't change that channel. Anyways, Jeff, the podium is all yours.
Thank you. Well, I guess we're setting up for one of the world's greatest anticlimaxes to end the whole event with a song that I put together at the end. I was once at a college debate, event where they said the debate topic was, is the following the world's greatest anticlimax: for God, for country, and for Yale? I didn't go to Yale, but I guess that was a dig at Yale's. I can't remember who won the debate, but I hope this anticlimax is somewhat smaller. I hope you enjoy the song at the end. So we can go to the next slide. This is just the title. And just, you know, for the first few slides here, I'm going to review some high-level macroeconomic developments, which I think most of you are aware of. A couple of things might be news to you, but most you will know. The point of this slide is just to say that unlike previous downturns that are caused by sort of internal machinations of the economy, excesses that build up, or either real excesses or inflation excesses, this one was caused by a pandemic, which had two effects. It made people pull back from doing things that would gather them together. And then as that happened, there was a more widespread decline as everybody had to shelter in place and so on. Yes, there were winners, but by and large, this has been a really dramatic decline. And the hallmark, as the slide says, is that the rapidity with which the decline occurred and the depth are unprecedented. So that's what the next few slides are going to show you. So next slide, sorry. So this is just showing you unemployment claims going back to 1967. You can go back further if you want, but they increased by about 26 million in a span of 5 weeks. That simply had never happened before. We just recently dipped below 1 million weekly new claims for unemployment insurance. That's sort of obviously the early sign of people becoming unemployed. In the 2007-9, the Great Recession, the peak for weekly claims was 665,000. So we're now at a point above that, and obviously we were way, way beyond that earlier in the recession. Next slide shows you just what happened to employment, the flip side of unemployment, essentially. And again, you just don't see numbers like this in history going back to World War II. We've had some interesting recessions, but never did we lose 21 million jobs in a single month. Good news there, of course, is there was some bounce back in June and July. We added about a little over 9 million jobs. So that's good, but we are not all the way back. We're still at an elevated unemployment rate. And as we flip to the next slide, you will see that the unemployment rate, which peaked at near 15%, according to the official measure, is down, but it's still above 10% as of the most recent reading in July. And this is the last bullet on this slide as a theme I want to keep re-emphasizing, which is that really the progress of the economy in coming months is going to be almost entirely dependent on the progress with restraining the effects of the disease and then ultimately finding treatments and vaccines. But importantly, in the coming months, it's how well behaved folks are around the country in terms of distancing and masks and so on. Because the less well behaved they are, the more economic disruption there will be. And I think there are signs that the surges in states, center, west, and south, while they're ongoing, we hope they're plateauing and starting to improve. This chart just shows you what happened to retail sales. Again, this unprecedented decline in retail sales. There were some winners there, grocery stores and online sales and so on, and a couple of others are marked as folks who did well as people quickly started to order online, for example, and obviously do more grocery food consumption than they did consuming at restaurants, food away from home. But everything else declined dramatically. The good news again is prior to the most recent surges in the rest of the country, there was recovery in retail sales in both May and June. And the July number, which came out Friday, not in this chart, showed some more modest improvement. I'd say there the rate of increase slowed relative to the previous months, as is the case for employment. So I think those numbers for June and July were the early signs of the possibility of an additional leg down in the economy that is, again, the manifestation of the disease running rampant in the rest of the country and causing additional social distancing and some shutdown measures that will, of course, of necessity, decrease economic activity. Okay, so in the next slide, you are probably excited to know what the forecast suggests. And I think, Peter suggested that the forecasts from last year weren't so good. Now, I think this is one case in which you can forgive the forecasters for making a mistake, because nobody predicted as of December or November or any other time last year that we were going to be in the predicament we are. But the forecasts looking forward are subject to tremendous uncertainty, again, largely because of the uncertainty about how the self-restraint will work around the rest of the country, and then how the vaccine and treatments might progress. There's a progression of forecasts in this slide that shows that early on in March, they thought things would probably be okay, even in March. And then they thought they'd be really, really bad, possibly a 20% unemployment, and they've pulled back a bit from them. And that's partly due to the reality of the public policy responses, which probably not optimal responses, but they did help. And I'll talk about those in just a second. But there, the next slide is going to show you some possible broad brush scenarios for the way the recovery goes. So maybe we can turn to that next slide. And what people hoped for was what we'd call a V recovery, which is a big decline of many percentage points in activity, followed by a very rapid increase in the next quarter or two. And that could happen, but based on the public health statistics, what's more likely is something like a W, which is we've seen a partial recovery in the economy. Some of the pullback in the other states will cause a decline of a magnitude that we can't be sure of yet, because the data is not at all complete for the time during which people have had to retrench again. So some kind of a W is probably more likely, but at some point between the second half of this year and early next year, it seems reasonable to expect a fairly rapid growth rate, because we declined so far that going partway back towards normal would imply a fairly rapid growth rate. But most important is that we get back to a level of full employment, and that will probably take longer. The reason for that is shown in the bottom chart there, which shows just the total amount of job separations, which were just huge. You could kind of tell that from the previous slide. This is the gross separations. This is just another way of saying that the amount of dislocation in the labor markets during this period has been rather dramatic. The good news is that some of the federal and to some extent state policies have helped bridge the time from the abnormal pandemic to times when people could go back to work. And in some cases they have, and that's great. But there's still a large number of, rematching of workers with companies to find jobs that's going to be occurring throughout this year and into next year. So I think I'll turn to the next slide now and just talk about some policy responses. So here, this is just my former employer, the Fed, pulling out all the stops quite quickly. They added $2.8 trillion to their balance sheet. That's a fair amount of money, even in the Fed business. And they bought a lot of treasuries. They bought some government-backed mortgage securities as well, and some other things. The point of those is just to make sure that those markets are functioning properly, because there were some signs of stress in even normally well-functioning treasury and U.S. government-backed mortgage markets, but there's some sign of stress there. So one thing they want to do is make sure those markets can function, but the other thing they're doing is ensuring that interest rates on all of those longer-term assets, mortgages, treasuries, some business loans, are not going to be higher than would be helpful for the economy. There's of course a limit to how much boost you get from keeping borrowing rates low, because for some businesses it's just not a great time to be borrowing and extending yourself. But for those who do, and there is still some ongoing activity there, interest rates on basically all kinds of instruments are quite low today. So that's what the Fed was doing. And the next slide shows you, just describes quickly what happened in fiscal policy. And as I suggested a moment ago, the job of fiscal policy in this recession really is to provide a bridge from the pandemic to the time when we can go back to normal, because if you don't do that, the entire economy really falls apart. There's nothing to stop it. So I think the good news, as I said, is the payroll protection plan and the extended unemployment insurance benefits did achieve some of that goal, which is why you saw employment coming back and retail sales coming back in May and June. That's really a direct result of those policies. They have not been able to avoid still a large chunk of unemployment and business failures. And the fact that both businesses failed and folks are still unemployed means that not everyone's going to be able to just walk back into their previous job. They're going to have to find new work. And normally that takes some time. And in the wake of a large event like this, where there are a lot of people looking for jobs again, hopefully later this year, certainly next year, that will slow to some extent the transition back to normal. How long that will take is very difficult to say. But fortunately, some of those federal policies were helpful in reducing the size of the disruption. And the near-term challenge, of course, I know you've all been looking at the papers on this, and the fact that unemployment benefits, the extended $600 a week benefits, have expired, and Congress has not yet reached an agreement on that, unless I missed something at 11:15 this morning. that is really important because there are folks who absolutely rely on that. The same thing is true of eviction suspensions. Some states have extended those, including our own. Others, they're working on it. And that matters as well, because if you're unemployed and you get evicted, you are in a spiral of bad consequences that's going to carry forward into the next 10 years of your life on average. So that's a quick tour of the macroeconomy. And the next topic I just wanted to turn to is, I think, timely because it's about race and both the economy. I crossed out economy to say it's really about race and the nation. It's never been the case that we've guaranteed equality of outcomes in our country, but we do hope that we have equality of opportunity for folks who are willing to work. And that is a really important ideal. What I'm going to say today is the reality is very far from that ideal in this country. So I want to look at some data on how equal opportunity is or not for income and for wealth, mostly net worth, but we'll call it wealth. So the next slide gives you one sense of that. This is drawing from research by Raj Chetty and John Friedman and Matt Hendren, who have looked at really interesting research because it looks at what happened to people. So this is a chart that shows you if you were born in the town of Arlington, Massachusetts 30 years ago, your household income today, stratified by your race and your gender and whether you come from low or high income parents, can be remarkably different, is remarkably different today on average, based on what neighborhood of Arlington you lived in. So that I choose that because Arlington, even 30 years ago, was not a bad place to be living. And yet, depending on which side of town you lived on, the income you have 30 years later could be higher or lower by a factor of 2 from the same town living just less than 2 miles apart. And then of course, if you switch to Mobile, Alabama, which is not a great place to be living on average, the relative gap is the same, right? You could, different place in Mobile, Alabama across town, you might earn 1/2 what your compatriot earned. But of course, the level there is 15 versus 30,000 rather than 30 versus 60,000. So both within those towns and then across geographies within the United States, these disparities are enormous, and it's a little hard to feel good about that. So why is that okay is the question. The next slide then moves from just differences by geography to highlight the differences by geography by race. And what I want you to focus on is the first numeric column in this table, the black low income column, to show you that for Somerville, Massachusetts, or for Mobile, Alabama, the disparities there between different neighborhoods for Black low income families. You started in a Black family of low income 30 years ago. Today, the disparities are even larger, 16 versus 39,000 or 6 versus 25,000. There are still disparities for white folks across those geographies, but the Black folks, the differences are even larger. So that's striking, I would say. So just to introduce this element, this demographic difference that I'm going to keep talking about for a couple more minutes. So the next slide. I just showed you income differences, household income. This one is based on a study that I supervised out of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston called The Color of Wealth. It looks at differences in median net worth, so that's your total assets less your total liabilities, as a percentage of white households' median net worth. And as you can see, for US-born Black families, that number is insignificantly different from 0. We don't have enough precision to say whether it's a negative number. In fact, you have more liabilities than assets, or slightly positive, but in any event, it's much smaller than the number for white households, which, as you can see at the bottom of the table, is about $247,000. There are differences as well for Caribbean-born Blacks, Puerto Ricans, Dominicans, and other Hispanics, all of which are small fractions of white wealth. And that matters, of course, because the accumulation of wealth occurs across generations typically, but it allows folks to pursue education, to start businesses, and to provide a buffer against ordinary income and expenditure disruptions. So really important for economic distress. And the next slide talks about some of the sources of the disparity. And the key point here is that this is not about, primarily, it's not about income differences. It is about changes in policy starting at least back at the Civil War that were explicitly designed to exclude Black and brown people from the benefits in terms of net worth building that they conferred to white families. And this is striking. There's a lot of, I've just put a couple of references if you'd like to read books on this at the bottom of the slide, but it is striking. And I'm not going to go through all of them, but policies that you know about, the GI Bill, unemployment insurance, and so on, up to the present, in terms of the spending disparities by district on education, as well as the very well documented and recently violently displayed differences in criminal justice. All of those things have allowed white families to build wealth and have explicitly excluded Black and more recently Latino families. Those impacts have lasted across generations, and that I think is a set of circumstances we shouldn't be happy continuing. So next slide, please. It's true that there are millions of poor white people as well, and that's not a good thing to feel good about as well. So not always the land of opportunity for white folks who also, as I showed, have their fortunes disproportionately determined by geography and just where they happen to start, who their parents are, and which communities they grow up in. The Fed has some work on that, as do many other folks. I'm trying to be nice to the Fed because they were so nice to me for so many decades. The quality of jobs work that points out that so many jobs are of horrible quality in terms of stability of income, provision of benefits, schedule flexibility, and all sorts of other things, childcare, that are necessary for a stable employment experience. So many jobs in the lower income deciles simply do not feature any of those attributes. So we have many millions of folks, working poor, who rely on public assistance literally to survive. The next site gives you some more information about that as well. So let me turn to the next slide. And so just to say, yes, poverty is everywhere, but there's a huge and additional and important layering if you were born a Black or brown person in this country, which leads to significant differences in income and net worth accumulation. So what are the solutions? So one part is to change the narrative, I would say, and that is most people carry around a story of why people are poor. And one of the most common is that the poorest people are the ones who don't work as hard as the really rich, hardworking people. And so this sub-bullet is one I'm going to make into a bumper sticker because I think it's really important. Laziness is equally distributed across income classes. I think that's a pseudo fact and an important one, which is to say, yes, there are some very well-off people who work really hard and good for them. There's some really poor people who work equally hard, and because of the initial conditions I've highlighted, they never end up having the same opportunities to achieve a measure of prosperity. So unfortunately, in the country, it's more about who's luckiest, partly by skin color, partly by the neighborhood you're born in, partly by the economic history, the family wealth that you inherit. And that, to me, is not consistent with some of our national narrative about who we aspire to be as a land of opportunity. That's a really good phrase. I like that phrase. It's a great aspiration. We're not there. The second big point here is that our nation, our government, and our private sector constructed this economic system and its reality. And so this is just my opinion, but I think we're jointly responsible for dismantling it. That is, fixing it. I don't mean dismantling the entire system, but dismantling the parts of it that do not work well for so many people. The next slide, we'll get to the conclusion almost. I think there are many pieces to the solution, and I think I've just listed a couple of them here. One is there are tax laws on the books that disproportionately favor more affluent, wealthier, and white homeowners. For example, the mortgage interest deduction. There are, of course, some Black families that benefit from that, but disproportionately it's affluent whites. And our entire economic system, which tends to do well for the wealthy, it sends profits to the wealthy, still quite profitable, produces below subsistence wages and benefits for so many people, and poor work conditions, and those are disproportionately people of color. We have to take a hard look at that and figure out, well, I think we know how we got there, but how do we make that system work better for everyone? There's no question in my mind that that will be costly, but I think we have to weigh that against the cost of watching generations, tens of millions of people across generations, not ever fully participating in the economy. And that's a terrific loss as well. So the final slide just says that in my view, this is maybe our greatest national challenge. And the last two pictures on this slide just point out that all the data I've shown you up to this point precede the crises. And those differences are being exacerbated as we speak, both in terms of the health effects and the economic effects. The top chart shows the health effects, which, as you probably know by now, are disproportionately borne by Black and brown folks, by Black and Hispanic folks. And these are case incidents right? And yes, there are consequences of the disease that vary based on underlying conditions, but the case incidence is just about who's getting the disease to start with. I think, and the bottom chart, sorry, shows that while we were making some progress on the disparity between unemployment rates for Black and Hispanics versus whites, we were, during this crisis, which is just the last few months, that has reversed. So in my view, that is an enormous loss of both economic and human potential, both of which I think should matter to all of us, and I hope they do. So that's what I wanted to talk about, and I hope that stirs some thoughts and questions, and nothing I have said is unambiguous or undebatable, so I look forward to questions going forward. But most of it's right, I hope.
Terrific. Thank you, Jeff. And it's sometimes giving credit to Rahm Emanuel, who said never miss the opportunity that a crisis represents. And so I think obviously we're at a real important time in our nation, and and I think those issues of equity are getting a closer look by more people than they have before. So thank you for that insight and for the overall view of the economic conditions. So next presenter is Julia Georgoulis, and Julia is the Director of Research for the East Coast in Canada at the real estate firm of JLL. Julia.
Thanks, Peter. It's a tough act to follow, Jeff's, especially with, really important messages, I think, about equality and things that we need to be thinking about as we emerge from this crisis. I'm going to take a slightly smaller view about the workplace and what this crisis has brought to light, but also some things that we were already seeing pre-pandemic. If you want to flip to the next slide. As with any economic cycle or real estate cycle, there are trends that emerge. If you think back over the past 10 years, one that comes to mind is urbanization and the focus on millennial talent. What we had seen prior to the pandemic is that some of those trends were already starting to shift, and the pandemic now we're starting to see inklings of maybe acceleration of some trends. The four that I have highlighted here is this idea of distributed work. Thinking similar to what we had talked about at the forecast event last year for Worcester, is this idea that urban centers will need to expand. Employers will need to find new talent in other places. And does this pandemic start to accelerate some of that trend that we were already seeing? That dovetails into the conversation of urban versus suburban, which in my opinion, I think became too black and white over the course of the past 10 years. And it's really not an either or, it's a when and where. And I think that there's a great benefit to secondary and tertiary markets emerging from this crisis, because people are starting to evaluate where they want to live and work longer term, which I'll get into more of the work from home conversation, because that's a kind of philosophical debate right now. But ultimately, we don't think that this will detract from the value of large cities. We think that there's an opportunity to complement large cities and create a variety and choice of workplace that maybe didn't exist in as meaningful a way over the past 10 years. And then lastly, how will the workplace look when we get back to work? Hopefully it's sooner rather than later, but shifting toward a focus of health and well-being, and reminding ourselves of all the values of why we went to work outside of our homes in the first place. So flipping to the next slide, this kind of complements, I think, some of the things that Jeff was sharing about the economy and the immediate impact on employment. What we're talking about and the question that we're trying to answer is whether or not the office is dead, and will we all go permanent remote work, or will we eventually get back, and what will the outlook be? And what we are forecasting is that we're obviously in a recession right now, and we're feeling the impact of employment loss. We're also wrestling with this new concept of more permanent work from home structures, while also trying to redesign the workplace to foster more health and well-being as we emerge from this pandemic. So what we do believe will happen over the next 3 to 4 years is that the net impact of people working from home, coupled with people needing more real estate to accommodate social distancing, will result in a net neutral impact to what we think will be office demand in the future. Flipping ahead, thinking about the return to work, which has been prolonged and challenged by a variety of different factors. This is a sampling of big brand name companies that you're probably all familiar with, and just highlighting the variety of return to work timelines span over the next 12 months. The most notable announcement was made 2 weeks ago by Google, who said that they will not be returning to their office for, roughly 200,000 employees for the next 12 months. They'll be back in the office July 2021. One of the reasons they cited for making that decision is acknowledging the challenge that working parents may face as we approach the school year. That will start to have a bigger impact on how some employees or how some companies will get back into the office. And we're watching that closely. It is still kind of a moving target for a lot of states and school districts as it relates to their school reopening plans, but it's no small impact to the workforce. And on average in the US, 67% of married couples have dual incomes with children under the age of 18. For the Worcester metro area, that is roughly 74% of married couples with kids under the age of 18 have dual incomes. This, of course, does not include single family parents or any other different family arrangements of caring for young children. But all of this is to say that, this will be a big impact in the near term. And what we are hearing from employers are just a variety of different flexible options to accommodate either longer work from home or flexible structures for schedules. But all of this will ultimately impact when people are able to get back to work more fully and more normally like we were in the past. And then this is a gauge of how employees feel about going back to work, and it includes some of our own surveying as well as peer surveys from the industry. And what we've been finding is that most people do want to go back to work. There is undoubtedly a small portion of the workforce that's enjoying the work from home benefits, the lack of commute, the better work-life balance, or the flexibility. But for the most part, people would like to get back into the office. And the number one reason they cite is because of the collaboration, the socialization, and the camaraderie that they build. We're also finding that younger employees are finding it more challenging working from home because they don't have the career development or the structure or even that ability to connect with people easily as a part of their career growth. So we do believe that over time, when it's safe and permitted, that people will start returning back into the office. And then flipping to the next slide, one of the biggest hurdles of getting back to work is how do you physically transport yourself there if you are dependent on public transportation. The Boston metro area is the third most dependent on public transportation in the United States. That impacts about 350,000 people. It pales in comparison to the 3 million people that rely on it in New York, but one of the benefits, I think, for the Worcester metro area is that it wouldn't even register on this chart. It's less than 2% of people that take public transportation. So I think that that's a positive and a benefit to dense urban areas, thinking about how do we successfully and safely get people back to work when it's safe to reopen offices. And then, just thinking about the value of cities and urban areas, a lot of the reason that urbanization emerged over the past 10 years is because of the young talent, the new ideas and the growth opportunities for the long term. And we do believe that cities play a vital role in that. I think if you look at Cambridge and all the innovation that's coming out of there right now, especially as it relates to our fight against COVID and developing vaccines, there is a great case to be made for the benefits of urbanization. But as I mentioned earlier, we were already seeing some of the challenges of rapid urbanization, congestion, intense population growth, and the cost associated with that. So we do think that there will be some benefit to lower cost suburban and lower cost urban areas that can take advantage of people who are reevaluating what they'd like their life to look like, in the near term and over the next several years. And then we can flip to, I think, the last slide. Oh, that was the last slide. So, in summary, we feel confident that, getting back into the workplace, just as a conversation about people getting back into the classroom over the long term, that creates a lot of benefits for our economy, for our people, new opportunities that Jeff had mentioned, we hope to see expand across a wide spectrum of people and professionals. But certainly it's going to be a flexible outlook for the next few months as we get control of the health crisis. And, really it's about responsibly returning to work and thinking about what do we need in the future to ensure that we're safe and protecting employees over the long term.
Terrific. Thank you, Julia. That was really insightful. And we'll dig in the Q&A section into a couple of the issues that I know folks have sent in questions on. Our next presenter is Robert Bauman. Robert is a professor and chair of the economics department at the College of the Holy Cross. Robert.
Thanks, Peter. Good to talk to everybody. Good afternoon. I'm going to try to hone in on some more localized data of the unemployment and earnings picture here in Worcester Metro. So, excuse me, the Bureau of Labor Statistics pumps out these handy local area unemployment graphics for a variety of MSAs like around the country. And so obviously you can see the chart there. This is the picture of unemployment rates in the light blue in May 2019 and the dark blue 1 year later during the pandemic. So you can compare Worcester, excuse me, both 1 year ago and today, and a variety of the suburbs that are adjacent to Worcester itself. So what you're looking at here is that Worcester fared a little bit worse in terms of unemployment compared to the rest of the country. That's Worcester City, that is, when you compare it to Shrewsbury, Grafton, and Holden. Next slide, please. All right, this is obviously the opposite of unemployment, but this is the employment picture. The most important graphic is all the way on the right side, which is the change from May 2019 as a percentage. So not surprisingly, from the last higher unemployment rates, which of course translates to less employment. All right. The third category, by the way, is just leaving the labor force altogether, which is a separate issue. But nevertheless, what I wanted to show you in this graphic is just some of the industry breakdowns that are true for our area. I believe these graphics are for the Worcester metropolitan area as it's defined by the BLS. So that's why it says Worcester area sitting up there at the top. Kind of not surprisingly, like who is most hurt by the most recent pandemic is leisure and hospitality. That's that 56.5%. So think restaurants, hotels, that's typically who would be in that area. Mining, logging, and construction, those are all grouped together in a BLS category. But of course, for Worcester, that usually means construction with a little bit of logging and a little bit of mining going on. But for us, you can interpret that first category, that 21.4% drop, to be primarily construction in the area. So this, the idea of this graphic is just to show you what industries have been most affected by what's going on. And again, not surprisingly, I mean, I'm sure you guys have seen what's going on with the hotels and the restaurants. They're the ones that are really getting hit the worst by this. Take me to the next one, please. All right, here's a picture of earnings in the Worcester metropolitan area, which I believe takes us like all the way up to Fitchburg, Leominster, and then stretches down the 395 corridor, I think even all the way into what would be northeastern Connecticut. So picture Worcester County plus a little bit. So like, you know, heading out to 495 on one edge, Quabbin on the other, as far north as almost the New Hampshire border and dipping a little bit down into Connecticut. So I don't know, like to me, this graphic is kind of fascinating because what you can see is the steady rise across the United States and how Worcester has sort of deviated around that. So, excuse me, taking us all the way back from 2007 to 2013, Worcester was a little bit better. Then we dipped starting around 2014 relative to the rest of the country. And what's interesting about that, of course, is that 2014, I mean, this is the middle of the expansion, all right? And so the country's feeling those effects and Worcester dips a little bit. And then right around the end of 15 and heading into 16, it climbs back above. And I know kind of my favorite aspect of this picture are those two spikes that you see right at the edge of 2020, which would be indicative of people making a higher average hourly earnings during the pandemic. And then of course it falls back down. So if you put kind of the information of these three graphics together, what you're seeing is falling employment, rising unemployment, and yet somehow what you have are average hourly earnings kind of ticking up a little bit. And so if you put these kind of three facts together, what it's indicative of is that the people that are losing their jobs tend to be on the lower income spectrum. So once you peel those people off of the average earning spectrum, the ones that have remained in there, obviously we're going to raise that mean back up. All right. And so I think what we're learning from this recession is, you know, kind of a lesson that we learn in a lot of different recessions, which is it disproportionately affects the lower income people. I saw a question on the Q&A that asked about kind of the dichotomy between how do you rectify the unemployment rate and compare that with the Dow Jones, which took a huge dive right in April, but has rebounded not quite to pre-pandemic levels. But it's getting back up there pretty quickly. And I mean, there's a lot of things that go into that. But again, if you put kind of these two facts together, I think what you're looking at is that the people that are most hurt by what's going on there are the lower income workers, you know, which is disappointing, but I'm afraid to say like this is pretty common in a typical recession. Next slide. Oh, look at that. I should have just went to this one and summarized the last thing. So here are all of these things that we have going on and everything I just explained. And in that third bullet point down there, again, that sort of odd dichotomy of average hourly earnings initially climbing. Now, I don't have a theoretical model that I'm putting together, but again, I'm kind of just being a detective and reading the tea leaves of these three statistics. And I think what you're noticing here is that the people at the lower end of the income distribution are the ones most affected. Next, please. All right, and now let's talk about Worcester in general. I've been living here since 2003, so I'm a bit of an outsider, which has been helpful so I can kind of compare some of the other places I was born and raised in the Midwest compared to the experience here. I'll give you like my sort of one sentence summary of Worcester. It's wildly underrated for a lot of reasons, and I'm not sure exactly why that is, but in the past like 5 or 6 years, I think you've seen a substantial amount of development happening in the Worcester area, and that's consistent with the average earnings graph that I showed you prior, where Worcester would climb back up the national average. So, I mean, this is just a list of things that have gone up in the last 5 or 6 years that have made this place, I mean, quite honestly, like a little bit more livable than it was, you know, prior to that. So a lot of nice development happening here. Some of this was spurred by public arrangements. Some of this was entirely private. Some of this was a little bit of both. That's not uncommon for a metropolitan area at all. But nevertheless, like we have seen like an uptick, in my opinion, in development here in the city. And then here are just some examples of the kind of things you've seen. Take me to the next slide, please. And we'll talk about the big one that's gone up and is continuing under construction. And that's the park for what will be the Worcester Red Sox, who hope to begin playing, excuse me, in spring 2021. So I wanted to highlight this one in particular, just to illustrate the potential risk that this park could bring to the city because of the financial deal that brought it to pass. So full disclosure, I was against public funding for this park, really right from the beginning. I tried to get in the ear of public officials to try to talk them out of it. One of the things that I've written about over the last 10 years are the economic effects of sports teams and stadiums on their surrounding area. Because my co-authors and I were noticing a trend, the NFL is one of them, where they would go to a city, they would ask for money for a new stadium, and then they would say things like, well, if you give us $300 million, as was the case in East Rutherford, New Jersey, to build a park for the Giants and the Jets in the NFL. Then what we'll let you do is host a Super Bowl. And we have this economic impact study that says like a Super Bowl in 1 week will bring you $300 and $400 million. So it's a wash for you. All right. Those numbers are wrong. And to see this happen in the backyard of the city that I live in, I've got girls in public schools here, was pretty disappointing. So a little bit of backdrop here. The park that is going up on the site of the old Wyman Gordon factory is publicly funded. The city of Worcester owns that park. It took out about $100 million in loans that it has to pay off over the next 30 years. It was a park that successfully lured the Pawtucket Red Sox over to Worcester. So the AAA team for the Boston Red Sox probably will be playing here next spring, obviously conditional on the pandemic. It was pitched as something that does not increase taxes in the short term. And the way that works, how does a city borrow $100 million? So keep in mind that Worcester itself has an annual budget of something in the ballpark of $700 million. So it's borrowing 1/6 to 1/7 of that. That, of course, it's paying over 30 years. So, it's like a stock and a flow difference. Maybe those numbers aren't exactly comparable. But nevertheless, like the way it pulled this off was through what's called a district improvement financing plan or a tax increment plan. DIF or TIF are the two names that you'll see most commonly. And the idea is this: the area around the construction of the park wasn't bringing in that much tax revenue because it was relatively underdeveloped. And so the idea from the city officials was, well, what we need is a magnet that will bring people to that area. What that will do is that will encourage businesses to put restaurants, hotels, gas stations, apartments, you name it, in the neighborhood that surrounds it. And we'll use that increase in tax revenue from all that development around this magnet, which is this minor league ballpark, to pay back this $100 million. All right. And so to get this thing passed, they hired, an economic consultant who helped them kind of do numbers based on like average attendance and stuff like that going forward. All right. The city did do one smart thing when they did this. They had a development sort of on the hook before they went forward with this. So they had some assurances that things were going to go up around the park, which made it more palatable. And then, of course, like as the park was being constructed, the pandemic hit and kind of the world changed at that point. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of the diff map and where the stadium is going to go in. So what you see in blue there is basically mostly the site of the old Wyman Gordon factory. The city had to buy some adjacent properties to construct it all. The ballpark district in red, that's where all the development is going to go in that will hopefully increase tax revenues to pay for what's going in blue. All right. So from a city budget standpoint, like what we're doing is taking a relatively unused part of the city and effectively making it self-sustaining, hopefully, in terms of the finances. So every increase that we see from the hotels and everything going up in red is going to be used to pay back the stuff in blue, hopefully. That's the plan. Next slide, please. And so obviously, when I was arguing against this going back a couple of years ago, of course, like I had no idea that the pandemic was going to hit and it was going to fundamentally change how we consume sports. It was going to cancel some sports and postpone some others. But I did try to pitch to every city councilor that I talked to, and I reached out to all of them that, look, the problem here is that we are absorbing the risk, we being the city, for this particular park. Never imagining, of course, that the pandemic would be the thing that creates that risk. And remember, for us to pay back these loans, we need that development around the area to be successful, which means the city needs people going to the park and spending money in the area surrounding the park. So obviously something like a pandemic, which could shut baseball down into the spring, or perhaps introduce some sort of like reduced attendance model, where maybe you have like a quarter of the people showing up. This is really dangerous for the city, because usually what we see with these new stadiums is that they are most profitable in the first few years, sort of called like the honeymoon period, where people are excited to go and then see the game, and then they go a few times, and then their attendance kind of wanes off into some sort of long-term average. If we're not even going to get those upfront benefits, all right, then we could be in danger of not being able to repay these loans unless we dip back in to the city budget. All right. And so that's the main risk that I see with Polar Park as it currently stands, is that we've got a 30-year loan on this thing. So we need this thing to be profitable going forward. There's about 60 games, 65 games in a typical minor league season. Another aspect is that the team basically controls all the programming to the stadium. The name Polar Park, the money that the Polar Company had given to put their naming on it, that went to the team. Every piece of advertising, every dollar you spend on beer, hot dogs, all of that goes to the team. All right. It was not a great deal, but this is kind of typical for these publicly funded stadiums. It's really this amazing thing. Like, try to imagine a bakery where you owned the physical building, you rent it to some bakers, and then some bakers put some signs on the exterior and the walls, but yet somehow the renters get that revenue. All right, this is really how backwards like some of these sports deals are. And if there's any silver lining in this, is that this is pretty common. Sort of all over the place. So, long story short here, I think the region as a whole, Worcester as a whole, is in pretty good shape for this. If you look at Worcester historically, this has not been a huge boom or bust area. It kind of creeps along at a relatively steady path. But we do have this potential risk of this park that we're building in downtown, and let's hope it all works. Thanks for listening.
Terrific. So I've got several questions that have been submitted, and some of them are sort of macroeconomic questions. Others are more specific to momentum. I'm going to start with one of the broader ones, and it sort of leans off what Robert was talking about, which is, some municipal debt funding. Obviously, the federal government's ability to fund deficits is different than the state. Jeff, can you comment on the current, we're printing money, we're cutting taxes, and we're creating more debt. Will that hurt long-term growth? And I asked another person asked to sort of comment on modern monetary theory, and if you can tell us what that is. Just sort of give us some sense of how long these supports are in place and what the long-term implications of them is.
Well, so every time we have a significant recession, the federal government, we hope, and typically does, step in to provide some support so that the economy can go back to be privately self-sustaining. That's one of its jobs. In the process of doing that, it tends to increase the deficit to some extent. So the question is that a bad idea because the deficit goes up? And I think you have to think about the counterfactual to assess that. If they don't step in, typically what happens is the recession goes on longer, tax revenues decline even further, and the deficit looks even worse. Now, this is an extreme example because it happened so fast and was so deep. But I think, once again, there was bipartisan agreement that spending $3 trillion, which is deficit spending, was better than watching the economy collapse in a heap and recover heaven only knows when. In the long run, I would say the good news is, while the US has a debt to GDP, so a debt burden, if you will, that's on the medium to high side compared to many other countries, with the exception of Japan, we have not, as best we can tell, been penalized by the rest of the world. The normal way that we're punished by the rest of the world is if we have too much debt and they don't believe the government can repay it, they'll ask for very high interest rates on the debt because it's a risky proposition. Now, you can look at government rates today, and there could be some tiny effect discernible there, but by and large, we're paying very, very, very low rates for our debt. So I'd say, yes, this was a good balance to strike. The federal government come in, deficit spend. It probably needs to do a bit more for state and local governments because they are in real deep doo-doo at the moment, and they don't have a way of addressing that without some federal help. There is a time at which, I would say it's not that far off, 7 or 8 years, there are some things we need to address apart from addressing recessions with deficit spending. We need to think about Social Security renormalizing. That can be done without too much fanfare, and Medicare, which is a really important and very popular benefit to most everyone in the country, but is probably not on a sustainable path. Those are things that once we get past the pandemic, if Congress is somewhat forward-looking, which I theoretically at least can happen, they need to look at those things and try to stabilize there. But I don't think now is the time to be worried about the deficit spending. It's keeping us afloat and alive in many cases.
Got it. Julia, question for you. You referred to the suburban growth as some companies decamp from dense urban areas. When we look at Greater Boston, which has really been the engine of New England's economy, do you see that growth being sort of a 128 phenomenon? Is it a 495 phenomenon? Does that sort of lend itself for development outside of 495 and west of Boston?
Yeah, so far, you know, a lot of migration trends will start to materialize in the numbers and the data upcoming. We haven't seen everybody didn't suddenly move to a more rural location. But we do think that, you know, New England and Massachusetts out to 495 will benefit for a variety of different reasons, not just the office and the workplace, but also industrial, manufacturing, all the R&D that's taking place. So I do feel optimistic that our innovation engine will need to expand in different areas. Some will be to take advantage of cost. Some will be to chase the talent. It hasn't materialized in a meaningful way yet, but we are hearing of companies considering split locations to accommodate commuting, to accommodate costs, to accommodate living trends and location trends.
Got it. Real estate related, but I think everyone can maybe chime in on this. We had a question looking at your view on foreclosures. I believe the state of Massachusetts has put delays in on apartments and residential foreclosures, but there's the commercial side and the residential side of that. And then potentially, you know, homelessness and other issues. Jeff, you referred to once someone's out of their living quarters, it's kind of a downward spiral. What do we see? There's been this crazy boom in residential real estate, right? Kind of like the stock market, as that's just sort of gone straight up in demand. How do we see that playing out over the next 6 to 12 months on the commercial side and on the residential rental side?
So one set of factors I would point to are that the reason that the last crisis was so bad was because we had a combination of high unemployment and really rapid declines in housing prices that left people underwater, meaning their house was worth less than the amount they borrowed against it. So that when they had economic troubles and couldn't pay, they didn't have the option of selling, and so foreclosures became quite widespread. So far, that's not the case. The unemployment's definitely high, but the housing values have not declined, and the household indebtedness on average is not as bad as it was back in that earlier period. So that suggests that if they're able to sell, that's a way of avoiding foreclosure at least, which leaves a mark on credit histories and so on. Whether that's the way things will transpire depends a bit on, you know, whether the state stops some people from being evicted and so on, and whether they continue to provide unemployment insurance so that people can continue to make house payments. Because even though, you know, avoiding foreclosure is nicer than having foreclosure, it's still not fun, and I'm using that term loosely, to leave your house and have to rebuild your life from there. So we might avoid some of the foreclosures. There's still a fair amount of economic pain in being dislocated and having to find some place to live that you can afford on government assistance or without that. So serious concern still. Foreclosure may not be the first one on the residential side. I'll let others talk about the commercial side.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, on the commercial side, you know, for office using employment, that has largely been able to shift to a work from home structure versus shutting down and feeling the economic impact that retail and hospitality has felt. So we haven't seen significant or any real distress at this point in the office sector. Retail, of course, hotels, those have experienced different shock waves as a result of the massive shutdowns. And, you know, there's talk of converting old mall space or retail space into distribution centers for large e-commerce companies. So I do think that there will be some creative opportunities that emerge from this, but certainly there has been some pressure on, you know, commercial real estate owners where they're facing a lack of rent payment from some of these businesses.
Yeah, and Robert, you kind of pointed out the tougher unemployment numbers in some of our urban areas, and obviously that's where there are a lot more rentals. Do you have any insights into how that trend might be going forward? especially in our cities?
Well, kind of depends what the government does. If we put a pause button on foreclosures and evictions and the like, I think that's going to have a real impact. No question about it. It's certainly in the lives of the people that this is affecting, and arguably also on the real estate valuations themselves. If you decrease demand, for these properties, the price is going to fall. And I think Jeff is dead on in the sense that the recession from 10 years ago that we call the Great Recession, which we might want to rename, given what we're living through right now. A major problem there was that the housing values dropped. And that is not what we're seeing in the local area, or as best I can tell, I'm not a real estate expert, in the country at large. So, I guess like my only sort of big takeaway from all this is that having, looked at these numbers for the last 3 months, our way out of this as a region and a country is to beat the pandemic. I'm optimistic, maybe a little bit more than Jeff is, that if we can beat this thing either via a vaccine, or through sheer will, by committing to social distancing and the like, I think we're going to unleash a lot of that aggregate demand that's been pinned back, as we're all saving money, and holding off to see what kind of happens with this.
Mm-hmm. So questions about the recovery. So Jeff, you had pointed out that, we've had a trend of, more virus cases, mostly in the South and Southwest of late. How is Massachusetts doing when it comes to the scorecard on recovery? And I know our unemployment rate statewide and obviously regionally has been higher than some of the national averages. So that's a question both for, the office side of things as well as sort of general economic recovery. Do we have advantages in the state that'll get us healed faster? And I know Robert talked a little bit about Greater Worcester's momentum, but what about the state in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think the state, I work for the state government now, so this is not a gratuitous compliment, but I think the state government has been data-based in thinking about how to proceed. And as a consequence, we have very low incidence rates around the population. We had a little increase in test rates. They're now back down to around 1.7%. That's a pretty low rate, and that's great. The consequence of that is the Massachusetts unemployment rate has stayed at around 15%, while the national rate declined. But that's a consequence of keeping things closed down, I guess the governor would say appropriately, so that that builds in a long-run advantage for the state. That is that as we move forward, we should be able to gradually go back to work at a pace that's appropriate more and more, as long as we keep monitoring the data, keep the distancing, and keep track of any hotspots that develop. We tamp down on those quickly. So I think that's a long-run advantage. It causes short-run pain relative to the rest of the country, but the rest of the country is experiencing the pain as we move forward. You'll see some of that in the statistics for August and September and October almost for sure. So yeah, it's a long-run advantage. It's just hurt us a little bit in the short run, but we knew that was going to happen.
The only thing I would add to that, we're the epicenter of life sciences, and I think having that sector here contributing to, solving this for us does put us in advantage. But it also creates a brand awareness for the sector for future business growth and industry growth. And I think that, Cambridge and the greater Boston metro area in Massachusetts was known for its research and development. I think that will only be multiplied by quite a significant amount coming out of this, and we can expect to see further growth in that area.
Hope you guys can hear me okay. I see my signal is going, and I just wanted to get one last question, and we're a little over time, but I appreciate everyone sticking with us. Winners and losers, Jeff. You talked about very few winners, but some of the leading industries in Central Mass are healthcare, manufacturing, higher education. What do we see as sort of trend lines in any of those particular sectors? Jeff, for instance, manufacturing, do we see more of a commitment to do less offshoring? Are there trends that are going to help those industries in particular?
Well, so I don't know. I'm not really a manufacturing expert either, but I'd say that the economic forces at play that have led to offshoring and use of lower cost labor and so on, those probably aren't going away. I think those changes would be something on the margin. The major hurdles to clear for the manufacturing sector right now are that the supply chain is disrupted, and they're trying to work with that as the pandemic clears. And I agree with Bob that once we get a vaccine, and so I think there will be a surge of activity. There's a lot of pent-up demand waiting to be expressed. It just will still take some time to get everybody back to work. But manufacturing, I don't see it suddenly all coming onshore. It's just not efficient. And what it will mean is everybody in the US will pay more for everyday manufactured goods. And I don't think that's where it's going to go. I think that's more of a marginal adjustment. Some of the other sectors, maybe some other folks want to comment on. Higher education, right? I mean, clearly there are challenges for higher education.
Yes,
Boy, yeah, it's been a wild year for higher ed, I can tell you that. There are colleges that are suffering, but not nearly at the rate as manufacturing firms, as obviously restaurants, as hotels. Again, like when recessions hit, it's that, sadly, it's that bottom rung, whether you're talking about workers, whether you're talking about firms, that's kind of first hit. For that reason, I think we're pretty fortunate. I don't know. I feel like I'm pretty fortunate to live in Massachusetts in general, when you compare it to the economies of other states in the country at large. As Julie mentioned, like one of the things that we've got, is kind of propping us up that has continued to have high demand are healthcare services and higher education. And that's true in Worcester, excuse me, and especially east of here as you head into Boston. So I'm optimistic for the long term. I guess I'm just impatient, in terms of when the pandemic is going to end and what that uncertainty, is creating. That's the frustration that, I'm feeling. I'm sure everybody else is. But once we get through this, whenever that happens, like I am optimistic that things are going to spring back, given a little bit of time.
Julia, kind of a narrower question related to that for you, just to kind of wrap up the questions. Worcester's biomanufacturing park, the reactory just announced 2 major new tenants. I'm wondering if that's a sector where you see, obviously there's been a lot of investment due to people searching for, cures to the virus, but that looks like some potential long-term. Is that a sector you see as being strong? Going forward?
All right, part of that cut out for me.
I was asking.
I think you were talking about biomanufacturing.
Biomanufacturing.
Yeah, I do see that as a great opportunity. And I think and Jeff and Robert could probably answer this a little bit better as it relates to reshoring of the supply chain. But I think if you start to think about, what we've experienced during this crisis and bringing back some of the supply chain for pharmaceutical manufacturing, it's a great opportunity for our market, and also complements the R&D that's happening with all the clinical trials and all the drug development in Cambridge and elsewhere.
Got it. All right. Well, on that note, we've kept you all 10 minutes late. We appreciate all your participation, Robert and Julie and Jeff. Thank you so much. We appreciate the support of Middlesex Savings Bank as our sponsor of this session.